With new adaptations of Tolkien's writings picking up steam in recent years, the question of accuracy seems to become all the more important. And it doesn't help how much polarization exists within our modern society in other parts of life. This polarization naturally affects everything cultural, and especially something as mainstream as The Lord of the Rings. Add to this issue the matter of brand recognition, corporate greed, and the trap of generic fantasy entertainment, and what you have is a crossroads. You see, those that control the intellectual property not only have to balance all of the above in order to turn a profit, but they also have to deal with one of the most infamously difficult books to adapt, maybe ever. And that's without getting into the Silmarillion, which poses its own problems due to the amount of events and millennia that are simply not covered, or are passed over for the sake of the mythological narrative. And so, what is the best way to balance all of these issues while trying to remain as faithful as possible to what makes The Lord of the Rings and Tolkien what they are? For starters, I think executives first have to be honest and truly open to understanding their audience. Things made for everybody are things made for nobody at all. You must understand the core of The Lord of the Rings and Middle-earth before you start to change it when necessary. Life and death, good and evil, hope and heroism. In the background, and those that have experience with Tolkien know better than most, you will even notice a glimpse of divinity as understood by Tolkien himself. God and his sole right to divine honor, as Tolkien himself is quoted as saying. These are just some of the themes of Tolkien's writings, what you could describe as the soul of The Lord of the Rings and his other works. I'm not a screenwriter, so I can't tell you exactly how to adapt the Scouring of the Shire, for example, after a 3.5-hour movie. What I can tell you is that whatever you show instead must have something that correlates evil to the destruction of nature through industrialization. If you're unable to translate the word on the page straight to a visual medium, then you must at least attempt to convey the intentions of the author himself with whatever you do decide to show. If you don't, then you're gradually removing what makes the work unique, and the very reason it became famous to begin with. If you disagree, or you're spiteful or condescending with Tolkien's views on divinity, hope, brotherhood, and so on, then how can you do justice to his story? When you inevitably have to make a change, you'll replace it with something alien. Longtime fans will be unsatisfied, and newer people might as well be consuming any other fantasy work. This, in my opinion, is merely a matter of mentality and of pure understanding of the work that you're adapting. If you come into a project with the mindset that your ideas and your ideals are better than the author's, then what's the point? The only thing you'll end up doing is use an intellectual property for brand recognition while completely diminishing said intellectual property. The name Lord of the Rings practically means absolutely nothing. Neither do the words Gondor, Rohan, or characters like Gandalf and Frodo. They're just sounds, letters on a page. What makes them what they are, the reason you get goosebumps whenever you think of them, is precisely because of what Tolkien made those sounds mean to you. If you think you can give these sounds better meanings, then you should make up your own sounds and do what you want with them. But alas, I doubt anyone would give you the budget for it. Ultimately, I don't think one-to-one accurate adaptations are usually possible to begin with. Even more so with something like The Lord of the Rings and especially the Silmarillion. The pacing is difficult, the text is often dense, and not every piece of dialogue and event can be included within the length of a film. You will have to cut something eventually, and once you do, you will then be forced to cover your tracks by changing even more things. The combined skill of the writer and of the Tolkien expert comes into place when balancing out these changes in order to keep the product engaging, while at the very same time not completely changing the source material. Where a process like this can go very wrong very quickly is, in my opinion, the Hobbit trilogy. Only 300 pages of Tolkien running for over 8 hours was the result of nothing other than behind-the-scenes contractual obligations and unnecessary filler. I think it is unreasonable for us Tolkien fans to expect completely accurate adaptations, simply due to the nature of the book. What we should expect instead are authentic adaptations. In my opinion, that's why the Lord of the Rings movie trilogy is as popular as it is. It made a number of changes, some necessary, some straight up bad, and not everyone likes them, least of all people that were actually close to Tolkien himself. And yet, you can at least feel the attempt at preserving the authenticity of Tolkien, regardless of what you personally think of its success. And so, these are some very important things to keep in mind for whenever a studio attempts to adapt the actual novels of J.R.R. Tolkien. In contrast, take The Rings of Power. It has been discussed to death at this point, but pay attention to certain things. The story it tries to portray is very loosely based on Tolkien's writings, and it could have been easy for the showrunners to stick with the basics of what Tolkien wrote and add their own fiction in between, where there was simply no lore to rely upon. Not only did they not do that, and not only did they change what was already there, but they managed to ignore pretty much everything that made Middle-earth unique, that made it stand out from any other fantasy world. In adapting Tolkien's elves, perhaps his most impactful fantasy contribution to date, let's give them buzz cuts or whatever Elrond has on his head. Regardless of whatever difficulties there are in writing a script, the way these creatures look is something that you should be able to get right. Tolkien was a very descriptive writer. He created an entire living and breathing world. His narratives can be complex at times, I understand, but for any Tolkien adaptation, the absolute bare minimum must at least be the visual representation of the world. Overall, I think these are things that most people can agree on. If you have the capacity to adapt Tolkien storylines accurately and not butcher the lore, then you should go for it. If you cannot, then at least try to make your alternative as Tolkienian as possible in substance. But what about products such as video games or shows that are based in Middle-earth but have no real connection to an existing Tolkien story? There, in my opinion, is where the majority of potential problems will come from in the future. If you butcher the Silmarillion or the Lord of the Rings, it's going to be very easy for people to critique your work with objective facts. For example, so and so didn't happen like that, or this character wouldn't act in this way. However, if you make something entirely new within Middle-earth, you risk mistaking the surface of Tolkien for his substance. You can't think that as long as there are swords, elves, and a few Quenya-sounding names, the story will feel like Middle-earth. Tolkien's world is enriched, but not only defined by its aesthetics. It is a world with rules, metaphysical weight and consequences, a world with consistent and well thought out depth. The problem is, if you get 1,000 Tolkien fans, myself included, and lock them in a room, you're going to get 1,000 different interpretations of the same thing. Which are you going to follow? This experience was one of Tolkien's goals when writing the book to begin with, but it doesn't make it any less difficult for the process of adapting his work. You can't simply throw a few buzzwords, some archaic sounding English, and call it Tolkienian. What you can do is delve deep into his letters and gain his own interpretation of the book. You can research his notes and posthumously published material or interviews of those closest to him. In my opinion, this can only be done by someone who truly appreciates Tolkien, and not merely because they were hired for a job. Take the Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War, for example. As video games, they're fun and boast solid mechanics and engaging combat, but as Tolkien adaptations, they're almost unrecognizable. Even moving past the messed up timelines, you have a ranger possessed by the spirit of Celebrimbor, creating new rings of power and commanding armies of orcs. A cool power fantasy to be sure, but as we've covered before, it completely misunderstands or outright ignores Tolkien's philosophy for the sake of creating a different type of product within the Lord of the Rings brand. It isn't about being a lore purist either, even though those games did misrepresent the lore quite a bit. It's about intent. Am I, as a writer, attempting to create something authentic, or am I somehow trying to fit as many recognizable trademark things as possible for the sake of a corporate quota? In the end, to answer the question of the video definitively, I think that Tolkien's personal standards for adapting his works, based on his personal letters, may have actually been impossibly high. Therefore, his hypothetical opinions on adaptations, while invaluable, can't always be taken as gospel. As more and more Middle-earth projects are released, it's important that people who truly understand Tolkien's mentality are put in positions that make a difference in the writing process. Otherwise, Middle-earth risks becoming a parody of itself, and its position as modern fantasy's primary inspiration may turn it from iconic to merely generic. A massive thank you to my channel members, and thank you very much for watching.